Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ethan Yorke podcast. My name is Ethan Yorke, and you are listening to episode 5. If you listened to the previous episode where I spoke about my opinion about legalizing drugs in the United States of America, you will have heard towards the tail end of that episode that I planned on the next podcast being about universal basic income. And that's exactly what I'm here to do. That's what this podcast is going to cover. But I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what the structure of this podcast is going to look like before we get too deep into it. So the first thing I'm going to do right off the bat is I'm going to talk about what universal basic income is for those of you who don't understand. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what potential problems does implementing universal basic income potentially solve. And eventually I'm going to transition into what problems does implementing universal basic income potentially cause. And then I'm sure I will have some closing thoughts after that. Those three little chapters, so to speak, is just everything that I have written down. And then everything after the fact would kind of just be off the cuff, so to speak. Although nothing scripted, I've just got some bullet points written down because sometimes my mind wanders and I have a hard time staying on topic. So shoot me for being 22. But anyway, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. What is universal basic income? Real simple. Universal basic income is the idea that either every member of the population within a given country or every member of a given population within a country under a certain income threshold that's relatively high. I feel like that's, we're not talking about, if you make more than $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year, you don't qualify for universal basic income. In my head, at least, the way I picture it is that a cutoff would be closer to like $100,000, $150,000, $200,000, etc. But it's essentially the idea that people that are registered citizens of a country are essentially guaranteed a certain amount of money from the government every single month to help them pay for basic necessities, right? Things like a place to live, whether that mean that they can, rent an apartment, or maybe they can get a roommate and, split some kind of rent situation somewhere, paying for food, things like that, medicine if they get sick, et cetera, right? The amount that people throw around seems to vary quite a bit because it doesn't seem like at this point in time this is a topic that seems to be super well circulated and often talked about. At least I would think for how serious I come to believe something like this is, you'd think it would be talked about more in this point of time based on its importance. But like I said in the intro, there's a lot of problems that come with implementing UBI, and it would take a lot of basically pre-planning to prevent them. But I want to jump into what problems UBI solves first, but I promise you this isn't just going to be a super positive, unobjective view on UBI. I'm really going to try to give both sides of the argument here. The biggest thing for me, the reason why I think universal basic income is so serious is because I legitimately do not think America's economy can survive without it. Period, point blank. It's a super serious statement, but let me explain. The way that our economy runs right now in terms of circulation of currency is you've got poor and middle class people who get, I don't mean to click my pen, I'm sorry. You've got poor and middle class people who get paid by their employers, usually upper class business people, all right? Those lower and middle class people spend their money almost exclusively at places or with services that are owned by upper class business people, right? Whether it's, they're buying a car at a car dealership, or the rent that they pay on the apartment or house that they live in goes to an upper class real estate owner. If they're looking to purchase a house, you're most likely dealing with an upper class real estate agent. Anytime you go and purchase a good or a service, right? Maybe like a car, or, you go and get some clothes from the mall. The money that is exchanging hands is going from poor middle class people to the upper class people. But the thing is wealthy people or members of the upper class will also exchange their money between the upper class but they also save/invest the money, meaning they put it in savings accounts, they throw it into the stock market. They purchase things with the intention of holding on to them because the thing that they purchased has some kind of inherent value that they think will go up over time, etc., etc. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that if you look at this situation as if we were in a box, and instead of money inside this box, you've got little metal marbles. Well, in our current country, at the very top, there are magnets that are literally sucking all of the tiny little marbles at the bottom, where all the poor and middle class people are, and it's sucking straight up to the top. Now, the top of this box doesn't have any holes, it doesn't have any tubes, it doesn't have anything. So unless the magnets are turned off, which just doesn't happen, those marbles never return back to the bottom of the box where the poor and the middle class people are. This means that literally eventually, it's just mathematics. We're not even talking about politics here anymore. Eventually, all of the money is going to be at the top, or at least most of it. And then there's not going to be that much money left at the bottom for the poor and middle class to support themselves. And this is a common theme in America. You see the term you see the phrase get thrown around, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I mean, that's kind of exactly how it goes, because in my reason for thinking this is because the money always flows to the top and it never flows back down. You could make the argument that this is because of not enough taxes on wealthy people. Honestly, it could be a number of things. I'm really not trying to get too deep into that debate right now. But not only is the situation of the poor and middle class not having enough money because the upper class is quote unquote hoarding it, that's not just a problem for poor and middle class people, okay? That is a problem for rich people because, again, the more money, the poor and the middle class are your customer. The more money they have, the easier of a sell they are. The less money they have, the harder of a sell that they are. You understand? So, yeah, it may seem cool in the short term that, oh, yeah, man, I love America. The rich get rich, the poor get poor. I own a business. You know, people are just spending their money. I got money coming in and out, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? When the money runs out from your customer, if you can't sell to upper class people who notoriously don't spend their money on things unless there's some kind of potential investment value in it, right? If you can't sell to that customer, you don't have customers to sell to anymore. Because the people that were once filling your lines with money, you meaning the class as a whole, not as an individual, right? In this case where I'm describing an upper class business owner, your class took all their money. So your customers have no resources left to give you for your goods and services. Whereas if your customers are constantly being supplied with a constant source of money, that customer is an easier sell because they've got more money to spare. If you want a perfect example, please just look up how much Jeff Bezos's net worth grew over the course of the pandemic. One could assume that the reason that his net worth grew so much was because when the US government was handing out stimulus checks, people were going on online marketplaces, such as Amazon, in which Jeff Bezos owns, and spending loads of money. The American people got 3 stimulus checks, and Jeff Bezos's net worth grew by, $90 billion? $100 billion? Somewhere in that neighborhood? Regardless, it could be $1 billion. It is an absurd amount of money, right? And some people can see that as a problem, but if you're looking at it in terms of universal basic income, if you're somebody who is more of an employee, more of a worker, you're like, okay, cool. I can get my money from the government. That will cover my basic necessities. That will pay for the roof over my head. I could feed myself, maybe my significant other, those people who depend on me, whatever. the money that they then work for can almost 100% be allocated towards things that they want, aka things that upper class business people sell. So it's, in my opinion, from the way that I see it, in this particular regard, universal basic income is a positive for both the poor and the middle class and the upper class, even if it takes an increased tax on the wealthy to do so, because the universal basic income would allow the US dollar to stay stable for longer. And the longer we've got a stable economy, the longer people can successfully run their businesses without it being 100% cutthroat, right? When you've got some kind of, massive, negative economic event, such as COVID, for example, things get cutthroat, right? The competition gets crazy because you've got people that, they need to stretch their dollar as far as it can go. And if it wasn't for those stimulus checks, even more businesses would have gone under. That's exactly why the stimulus checks got handed out in the first place. The whole purpose of it was to stimulate the economy, right? But the thing about the stimulus checks is that they literally printed more money to make that possible. If you were able to implement universal basic income, if you were able to budget that without it requiring the printing of more money, you hypothetically would never need to print more money again, right? Because it seems like in a lot of these cases where we're just printing and printing and printing, it seems to be, because in some regard, someone is coming to the aid of the poor and the middle class. There's not enough resources, aka money, to go around because the rich people have it all. So they need to print more money to give to the poor and middle class to make sure that they get through it all. You understand what I'm saying here? So overall, like I've said before, you're looking at a net positive from every direction that this comes from, because you're allowing the economy to stay more stable over a longer period of time, which, even if the business owners have to pay more in taxes, it allows them to run their businesses successfully for longer before there's some kind of event that, pulls the rug out from under them and then their business collapses. Nobody wants that, right? The business people don't want their businesses to go under, and poor and middle class people don't want to not have enough money to be able to buy the goods and services that they want. But circling back to that other point, I lost track for a brief moment there. If you can budget in the $6 trillion, and because, like I've said, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the entire U.S. population that they totaled on the census times $1,500 a month would be $6 trillion a year, which is an insane amount of money. I'll get to the specifics of it a little bit later in the problem section. But if you could budget that in without having to spend more money, it would really, when you think about it, eliminate most circumstances where the U.S. government would be forced to print additional money. And if the government isn't printing additional money, it slows down the rate of inflation for the U.S. dollar significantly. And that's why I said when I first started with all of this, I think America needs universal basic income to keep the US dollar alive. Because what's the other alternative, right? Poor and middle class people spend their money differently. That's culture. The way that people spend money is culturally ingrained within them. You're not just going to get poor and middle class people to spend their money more wisely. Unless there was a massive overhaul of the education system in which there was a much greater focus on financial education, you're not going to get poor and middle class people to change their spending habits. It just won't happen. So that's an option that's off the table, right? In terms of stopping inflation. Well, if they changed their spending habits and we didn't need to give them so much money, then we wouldn't need to print money. That's an unrealistic expectation, in my opinion, because there's so many variables that go along with that. Finding $6 trillion in the budget, although it could be insanely difficult and is obviously going to require additional legislation, which potentially is going to cost people more money, in the long run, it could be the only thing that saves the American economy, saves the American dollar. Because I think if we all know, even as me, right? I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician. I don't know you know what I mean? I'm not any of those things. But even I, as a dumbass on the internet, can see that if inflation keeps going and going and going and the US dollar keeps being worth less and less and less and less, we're going to have huge problems. So inflation is something that needs to be dealt with, and I think universal basic income certainly addresses that problem. Another problem that I think it would solve, these are a little more on, let's tackle the next closest serious one. You're talking about less homeless, like almost guaranteed, right? If people have, whether it's 1,000 or 1,500 or however much it is that's coming in every single month, guaranteed. Maybe not everywhere will that amount of money buy you a place to live. It won't. But it'll at least give you enough resources to where, hey, if you know what I mean? If you got to find a roommate, or if you have to go on, Craigslist or Airbnb, or just, find some kind of creative solution, having a little bit of extra money in your pocket that you know is going to be there every single month gives you a hell of a better chance to keep yourself off the street at night than if you were to have no money coming in whatsoever. And that's just obvious. But some people see the homeless issue from, I just want to see less homeless people, blah, 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 they're everywhere, blah, 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 blah. And some people see it as a human rights issue. Well, either way, I think regardless of your stance on homeless people, which seems like a ridiculous thing to say, I think we can all agree that less homeless people is better. Not only because you've got, less people living a life that is, truly awful in comparison to the way that some other people in this country live their lives, you know what I mean? But think about how much money the American government probably spends on dealing with the homeless, because it's not just, the fact that there are people outside, not in houses. There's often loads of trash around areas that have a lot of homeless, which, believe it or not, there's somebody who's going to have to come in and get paid to clean up all of that mess that those homeless people are making. You've got, all the drug issues that, surround the homeless, right? Like a lot of homeless people, it seems to be a pretty well documented fact, will, fall into drug addiction of some point, or of some form rather. And then you've got multiple issues, right? But the biggest being is that, and this happens frequently, you will see homeless people doing drugs in public. And regardless of what your stance on drugs is, I'm obviously a pretty pro-drug person, if you heard my previous podcast. But, I'm also not naive enough to think that a 6-year-old sitting in the back passenger seat of a car should see somebody shooting heroin under an overpass that looks like they haven't showered in 6 weeks. You understand what I'm saying? So, giving people the resources to prevent them from ever becoming homeless not only helps the overall, I feel, morale of the country, but it also ends up saving us a little bit of money in the long run too. Of course, a program like this would cost an enormous amount of money, but I'm just saying, in some facets, having a program like universal basic income that keeps people from being homeless, allows us to maybe allocate some money that we used to spend dealing with that problem and putting it somewhere else, that can be used to some other benefit, right? The next thing that I feel like is really important, mostly just from a human psyche perspective, and this is something that I feel like people will be less sensitive to because it's more of a feelings issue, and I realize some people aren't. They don't really care, you know what I mean? It's like, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit type of deal. I know there's a lot of people out there that are like that. But anyway, with a situation like universal basic income, your base needs are taken care of. So if you're getting, let's say, $1,500 a month, right? And maybe you want a house, or maybe you want a car, or instead of renting wherever you are, you want to finally buy your first house, or maybe you want to buy this like certain type of car, or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Having a system like universal basic income allows people to essentially have the things that they need taken care of, and everything that they're working for, like the thing that they're working, spilling blood, sweat, and tears for, right? Going to work every day, working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, blah, blah, blah. If somebody chooses to do that, the money in which they receive from that could 100% go towards things that they want or things that make them happy, instead of, kind of the system we've created where there's a lot of people working 8 to 12 hours a day, 5 to 6 hours a week, just to keep a roof over their head. And they have really no positive outlet whatsoever, because their entire existence is based around getting the things that they need to just get by. I realize that's not everybody's situation, but it is a lot of people's situation. And this kind of transitions into my next point, is that if you give people that possibility, sure, you're going to see a lot of people buy a lot of dumb shit. You're going to see a lot of young people spend their money on stupid things. It's going to happen. But I think the bigger consequence of something like this is a massive spark in innovation, right? Let's say you have a guy who's been working at a job for 5-10 years, and he's always kind of had this business idea in the back of his head, right? Well, if he's getting $1,500 from the government and he's getting X amount of dollars from his full-time job, he may be able to afford to take a step back on his full-time job down to part-time, use the money that he's getting from universal basic income to supplement what he's missing out on going from part-time to full-time, and then spend that extra time he has chasing that passion of his, trying to build that business of his, maybe trying to patent some kind of invention that he's come up with, right? And there's a lot of people in America that are coming up with inventions and innovations every day. But something like universal basic income gives that ability to everybody, essentially. I mean, listen, $1,000, $1,500 a month isn't a lot of money, at least when you look at it individually. Of course, if you look at it across everybody in the whole country, it is a lot of money. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not an enormous amount of money. It's not an excessive amount of money. But it just might be enough for many people within this country to get the breathing room that they need to pursue something that they're truly interested in. And honestly, isn't that what we really should be doing? If we allow people to gravitate towards the things that they're really interested in and the things that they're really passionate about. Think about it. Every time you go to buy something, you're going to be buying it from somebody who is hell-bent passionate on whatever that thing is, because that's what they really wanted to do in life, and they were given the opportunity to chase it. They went after it, and they got it. Everything. You know what I mean? There would just be so much innovation. People would be able to give themselves that breathing room to chase what really makes them happy. And a lot of what makes people happy ends up leading into innovation for either the entire country or maybe even potentially the entire world. I mean, think about all the stuff that Elon Musk is into. That's all stuff that, granted, I understand that it seems pretty clear that he's got a good view on the overall big picture of what he's looking into. But he got the opportunity to pursue something that he was passionate in, and look at all that he's done for the world, whether you like the guy or not. You understand? So if you give more people that kind of opportunity, I think it's an overall, again, net positive for the entire country. Now let's get into the downsides, okay? Because there's a couple of them, a few that I touched on. The first being is that it's insanely expensive, right? It's unbelievably expensive, as I said before. If you take the amount of people that are in this country according to the 2019 census, and you times that by $1,500 per month, every single month for the entire year, it would cost the American government $6 trillion a year, which is about 6 times more than Medicaid and welfare, which is the thing that we spend the most money on. That's the largest item in the federal budget. And it's also almost twice as much as what the federal government collected in taxes in total between October 2018 and September 2019. So again, it's insanely expensive, which means, I mean, if again, look at it from a mathematical standpoint. Universal basic income for everybody in the entire country would cost more than what the government collects in taxes in total. So one of two things: you either reduce the number of people who could qualify for universal basic income, or you increase the amount of money that you bring in taxes. There's no real if, ands, or buts about it. So there would obviously have to be some kind of increased taxation. Again, that whole IRS leak that came out not too long ago, it's no secret that some of the most powerful, richest men in the country, or richest people in the country, they don't pay anything in taxes, virtually nothing anyway, in comparison to the percentages that the quote-unquote everyday hardworking American pays. So I would like to see some kind of increased taxation, on those members of the upper class. But, again, keep in mind what I was saying earlier is that if we can implement these kinds of tax, overall, it makes it a better environment for businesses to thrive, because you've got more customers that have money that they're willing to spare, so to speak. You know what I mean? So yes, you'll pay more in taxes. You won't get to take home as much. Like I 100% understand why that's not appealing. But as I stated before, really the only other option, at least the way that I see this going, is a total economic collapse. And, at the point where really the only businesses that would survive would be the incredibly massive, huge ones, and the ones that deal in selling necessities, right? Like, people that sell property or rent out to people or provide food and things like that. Any other business, if inflation gets so bad and the rich people and upper class individuals continue to hang on to their money instead of recirculating it back into the economy, like I said, that's a serious problem. It's going to be a really cutthroat environment for businesses, because the customer base is going to be smaller, and I feel like that's something that we could pretty easily forecast. The next problem that UBI causes, this is a bit of an issue, is that it enables the potential vote for more money strategy that a politician could play, right? Because if you introduce some kind of legislation that brings universal basic income into the United States, obviously universal basic income would have a dollar amount. So you're potentially opening up the door for politicians to come in and say, hey, if you vote for me for president, or you vote for me for whatever position, I'll help get universal basic income pushed to $1,600 a month, or $2,000 a month, or $2,500 a month. And obviously that is an overall net negative thing, because, there are going to be people that are willing to completely disregard how bad somebody may be for a political position, simply because that person's going to give them more money or is promising them more money once they get into office. So I think we would need to do something about that. There would need to be some kind of law put in place stating that universal basic income couldn't raise by a specific percentage, or maybe there are specific timelines that are set up for increases in UBI. For example, you can gather some of the smartest economists in the world, have them forecast forward what potential inflation with UBI introduced would cause, and then forecast forward, okay, by year 5, we're going to need to increase UBI to this specific dollar amount. And by year 10, it would need to increase to this specific dollar amount in order to keep up with inflation. I think it would need to be some kind of hard, set in stone law or rule or regulation or something that would prevent politicians from being able to manipulate the UBI system to potentially get more votes from people. I don't have a perfect solution to that. I really don't. I don't have enough background in politics to really understand exactly how all those things work in terms of, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and all those different kinds of things. I'm incredibly ignorant when it comes to that. So I'm not necessarily pitching you a solution, but I am letting you know that it would be a potential problem with UBI. And before it could be implemented, we would have to basically pre-think the solution to that problem so that the problem wouldn't come up at all. The next big issue with universal basic income is that it could actually spike inflation. So kind of the opposite of what I was arguing earlier about universal basic income protecting inflation. Because obviously if customers have more money to spend on goods and services, there are going to be many business owners that see that as an opportunity to expand their profit margins because people have more money to spend. And then obviously as things get more expensive, inflation kicks in, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure most of you understand how inflation works. I think most businesses, in terms of how much they profit, how much they don't profit, I don't think that that's something that should be determined by the government. Definitely not in this country. But if UBI was to be put in place, I do think that there would need to be some kind of regulation on goods and services that fall into the necessities category, right? So things like housing, renting, things like that, food prices, et cetera, et cetera. But I definitely don't think that the regulation has to really overstep that much. I think it could be pretty simple, especially in terms of, renting and houses and things like that, because I'm almost positive there's already regulation that's pretty similar to this, but essentially putting something in place where you could not raise the price of a good or a service by a certain percentage each year unless there was a corresponding increase in cost either for the product or to make the product available, right? So for example, if you know that everybody's getting $1,500 government checks now, you can't just change your rent from $1,500 to $3,000, right? I understand that that should be the right of the person owning the apartment, but if you allow people to do that, you will just, you know what I mean? You're going to create the same problem that UBI is setting out to, to prevent. And honestly, real estate is such a good investment as it is. Like when you rent out to people, like I understand that there's hiccups, with tenants trashing your place and things like that, but there's really no need to the profit margins on real estate is already good. It's so good already, both in terms of if you purchase a property and you sit on it for a little bit and it'll appreciate in value, as well as the fact that you can literally have somebody pay for the house that you have a mortgage on while they're living in it. You build all the equity and they get the right to live there. You know what I mean? So it's real estate is already a sweet gig as it is. I don't think putting regulations in place preventing property owners from completely taking advantage of people would be too far-fetched, and I don't think people would be too upset about that. Obviously, when it comes to selling houses, that control goes to the people who actually, own the home in that case, and I understand that that might be a little bit tricky to regulate. But, I mean, if you've noticed, house prices seem to kind of correlate with rent prices a little bit, meaning that you can't have a mortgage payment that is so outrageously higher than than what rent prices are. Otherwise, you're going to basically force people into renting and nobody's going to buy your properties. So if the rent prices are regulated, it should in turn keep the actual home prices in check as well, at least, as far as people trying to overprice them to take advantage of the increased amount of money in circulation type of deal. So those are my main points for universal basic income. I'll run through them again. What problems does it solve? I think it allows the US dollar to circulate better between all the classes that we have here economically, and reduces, if not completely eliminates, the need for the government to print more money going forward. Obviously, giving people enough money to pay for their basic necessities like shelter and food should ultimately lead to less homeless people, which is not only good from a human rights standpoint, but it's also good because our country in general and certain cities in particular spend a lot of money dealing with problems that a large homeless populations cause. So ultimately, we would be able to allocate money that was once spent fighting the homeless and maybe direct it towards something else, maybe something in the education sector, or something of that nature. The last problem that I think UBI solves / something that I think it could spark that would be really positive is that if the people's base needs are essentially taken care of with the amount of money they're receiving from the government, it means that the amount of money that they're actually working for, using their labor for, can go towards things that they actually want, which I think can both improve the overall morale of the country, since you've got so many people that currently are just working to keep a roof over their heads instead of having some kind of purpose or passion in life. But I think this could also be a huge spark of innovation in this country if you've got more people that are able to work part-time instead of full-time so that they can pursue their passions. You're going to have more startup businesses, more people coming up with ideas. And I think that overall is just going, it could be a net positive for the United States. What problems does it cause? As I mentioned before, it's insanely expensive, almost twice as much as what the U.S. collects in taxes every single year, according to data between October 2018 and September of 2019, and it's about 6 times as much as the largest item on the federal budget. So clearly, the U.S. government is going to need to make way more money if it's going to implement a system like this. But I think if this is something that we were willing to come together and support as a country, I think there may be 1 or 2 smart people left in the government who would be able to pull it off without it being a complete catastrophic failure. The another problem that it potentially causes is that it enables a vote for more money strategy to be employed by potential politicians, meaning that if UBI is currently set at $1,500 per month, a politician could promise $2,000 a month if they are elected, and despite the rest of their politics maybe being garbage, they may end up getting elected purely on the basis that they're promising more money, and obviously that's not good. Last thing that I mentioned as a problem with universal basic income is that it could cause potential inflation, since consumers have more money to spend and business owners may want to increase their prices because of this. But as I mentioned, I think some kind of regulation in the Department of businesses that deal in necessities like, food, water, shelter, things like that, they may have some very light legislation or regulation to prevent them from completely taking advantage of people and pricing the poor and middle class out of being able to afford those things. But I don't think that it should be very heavily invasive at all. The least amount of regulation would be possible just to make sure that order can remain. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this. I realize that this has been a little bit of a longer episode, at least in comparison to episode 4, but I genuinely would like to hear your thoughts, because the thing is if you come in the comment section and you bring up a valid point about a problem that universal basic income poses if it's passed, right? Or if it's something that starts being taken seriously, I want to know about it, because then that gives me an opportunity, somebody who is pro universal basic income, to try to find a way to have that problem mitigated so that UBI can be implemented, but implemented in a way that is as much positive as it can possibly be and limit the amount of negative consequences to a small number as possible. So if you have any criticisms about UBI, if you don't agree with me, anything like that, shoot the criticisms my way down in the comments section below. If you are listening on YouTube, I would love to hear it. If you've got some other ideas on UBI, whether you're for it or maybe you like it for a different reason, or maybe you wanted to expand on a point that I made in this podcast, again, please let me know down in the comments section below. The more feedback, the better. If I know you guys are listening, it gives me a little bit more motivation to keep doing these things. And as somebody who is self-employed and works significantly less than 40 hours a week, the fact of the matter is I have a lot of time where I'm sitting down and I'm thinking about larger issues like this, because my time isn't occupied by the constant stress of being at work by a specific time and leaving at a specific time and only having a short amount of days off. Some can see that as a bad thing, right? As me being somebody who's not productive, but I think it gives me the opportunity to explore some issues that I think most people don't have time to explore. And ultimately, I think that's how conversations get started and ultimately problems end up getting solved. So that's really my goal here, and I hope you guys appreciate it to some extent. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to talking to you guys in the next video.